All right. When I was young, my parents, we had a two-story house, two-story house in Alexandria, Virginia. That's where I grew up. And they turned the bottom story into a missionary apartment so that missionaries would be able to come, kind of stay for free, and when they went on deputation, which means raising money. And so I was exposed to a lot of missionaries and a lot of various types of Christians growing up. And the longer the missionaries had been a missionary, the more experience they had, the broader their view of God was. And the more accepting they were that maybe there was a little bit more to it. And so I remember distinctly one missionary, his name was Alan, and him and his wife stayed with us for about a year, maybe 2 years. And so I would see them every day. They kind of lived in our basement, if you will, which had a separate interest. It was like a separate home inside the home that I grew up in. And I remember him talking about Bereans. And, as I was a teenager, and forming my views, he basically was just like, challenge everything that you're told. Make sure that it aligns with what you see in the world. Make sure that no matter who you talk to or what it is you believe or what ideology that you come up with and that you start to gravitate towards, that ideology, you question it and you know why it is that you believe it. And I've thought about that ever since, because no one had ever said something like that to me growing up. And so, I did gravitate towards an ideology, and I did, obviously choose churches and play worship for music for about 10 years in a church, and I was very comfortable with what I believed and what I thought I believed. And then I saw this massive shift, not just within the church that I was in, but a shift within Christianity itself in recent years and in talking to pastors. And I guess the more I grew in the church, if you will, I started to run a nonprofit and was almost working full time. I was working full time, kind of in that world and going to conferences and speaking and still, leading worship or being a member of a worship team, etc. I began to see things slightly different and started questioning. Especially in talking to people who were exposed to Christianity that was more global, right? Christianity around the world. That the American view of Christianity was kind of different than most of the rest of the world, and how they thought about God and how they viewed Jesus, etc. And so I began to journal, and I have hundreds and hundreds of journal entries that I've been going through and trying to figure out, what do I do with all these journal entries and how to make sense of them and what do they mean and what was I going through? And I've come to, some conclusions. And I'm still very curious about this idea of, where did we, as American Christians, where did we go wrong, if you will, or how is it that we have come to believe certain things that are just not in the Bible that a lot of Christians believe are in the Bible? And I had first, I was talking with a pastor friend of mine, and it was like, well, here's, 9 things, and then I narrowed it down and narrowed it down and narrowed it down, and I've narrowed it down to, I think 3 core concepts that, in my opinion, are just not in the Bible, that a lot of American Christians believe, that I think differentiates someone from being Christ-like versus anti-Christ-like in their Christianity and in their daily walk, and in kind of how they view the world and how they view life. And so now I view everything through that lens: Christ-like, anti-Christ-like. And why do we think and behave and act and have policies and worldview as Christians vastly different than the Christians from the rest of the world who have had Christianity way longer than we have in America. So at some point, we took a divergence from what was orthodox, or maybe I should use the word, a longer tradition, a more historical tradition of Christianity, made a modern view of Christianity. How did we get from what we used to believe to what we believe now? And I've got a lot of thoughts on that in hundreds and hundreds of pages of notes and ideas. But one of the things that I want to talk about today, and I think that might be one of the core pieces of this, is this idea of univocality. Let me explain what univocality is and some of the issues with that I have with this idea. So the term univocality means that the Bible, or the scriptures, the ancient text that we now call the Bible, which was written over a long period of time, and which we don't fully have the authorship for every single one, but it has been compiled into the 66 books that we have. And so it's the idea that this is perfect in a way to where, even though these books were written over a long period of time by various authors, that they do not contradict each other, and that it speaks with one voice, or it's univocal, one voice. And what's interesting is that is making a claim upon a piece of text that the text itself doesn't make. The authors don't make that claim. No one really makes that claim until rather recently. And there's a lot of problems with thinking of the Bible as being univocal. One of my favorite pastors likes to contextualize it this way. The Bible was written by people trying to serve God, living in a specific time, in a specific place, with the traditions that they had handed down to them, with their geopolitical environment, and wrestling with what is our relationship to God as individuals and as people. And you can see over time, from the books that were written first to the books that were written last as they were compiled, that relationship kind of morphs and changes and expands and grows. And when you allow for this understanding of a compilation of texts written by people struggling with the same struggles that we struggle with, maybe having a different geopolitical context, a different landscape, a different understanding of science, a different understanding of other religions and other people groups in their area, and struggling with that. Once you start to understand the historical context of everything, the Bible just makes a lot more sense when you're not trying to make it as if it was written to you. And instead of understanding who was the author of each individual book thinking about, what were they going through, what was happening at that point in time, it makes the thing, for me, way more interesting to read. It really makes it kind of come alive, and it really makes it fun, because you're reading not just the text, but you're digging into what was happening at the time that these texts were written. And then you start to understand why there might be, and allow for these discrepancies from one author to the next. And instead of jumping through all kinds of theological hoops to make them align, you just allow them to be perfect in their imperfections, right? You allow for space for, it's okay if Paul disagreed with some of the disciples. It's okay for these arguments to exist, just as we have disagreements with each other. It's okay not to know the answer to some of these things, if you will. I don't have to struggle with all kinds of odd theological, jumping through all these hoops to make things happen for univocality to exist, when you just allow the texts to be the texts. And for me, this is just a freeing idea, a freeing concept. allow it to be this book of people struggling with their spirituality just as we struggle with our spirituality, and them writing it down, them being inspired by the divine inspiration. The false belief is that we can take these writings out of the context in which they were written and then move them into our context and directly apply instead of being inspired. That initial false belief as to what the Bible is and believing in univocality leads to other false beliefs, which I'll talk about in other videos. Just go to the YouTube timeline, and there they are. Thank you.